Hey guys, tonight we're going to settle in and explore a place that was both a refuge and, frankly, a bit of a sensory assault. A Viking longhouse during the long, dark, teeth-chattering heart of winter. Imagine it now. You've been traveling, maybe through biting wind or swirling snow, the kind of cold that seems to find its way into your very bones no matter how many layers of rough wool you're wrapped in. The sun, if it showed its face at all today, vanished hours ago behind a bruised-looking horizon. You're tired, you're hungry, and honestly, you probably won't survive much longer out here. But then, through the gloom, you see it, a low shape, a hump against the landscape, with a faint wisp of smoke curling up from the roof. It's the longhouse, your destination, your only hope for warmth and shelter until spring. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the deepening snow, each step a small effort, the frozen ground hard beneath your worn boots. The wind whips around you, carrying the sting of ice crystals. Up ahead, the longhouse grows larger, more defined. It's not a grand castle, not a towering structure of stone, but a long, low building, often resembling an overturned boat hull, or just a rise in the ground itself. Its walls are typically made of turf piled high upon a timber frame, the roof thatched or covered in more turf, sometimes held down by stones. This simple construction is surprisingly effective against the elements, a barrier of earth and plant matter trapping what little heat can be generated inside. As you get closer, you can hear sounds filtering out, muffled voices, the occasional bleating of an animal, maybe even a burst of rough laughter. It sounds full. And then there's the smell. Even from outside, you can catch faint whiffs carried on the wind. Wood smoke, certainly, but something else too, something animal, something human, something earthy. It's a smell that speaks of enclosed life, of many bodies and beasts huddled together against the cold. You reach the heavy wooden door, often set into the shorter end of the longhouse. It's thick, perhaps bound with iron straps, designed to keep the outside out. You push against it, and it swings inward with a groan, revealing not a grand hall, but an immediate assault on your senses. The first thing that hits you is the heat. Compared to the biting cold you just escaped, it feels almost overwhelmingly warm, a thick blanket wrapping around you. But that warmth comes at a cost. The air inside is dense with smoke. There's a central hearth, or perhaps a series of hearths running down the length of the building, and while there are openings in the roof to let some smoke out, much of it lingers, hanging in hazy layers. It stings your eyes slightly, makes you want to cough, but oh, the glorious warmth! Then comes the noise. It's a low roar of human activity. People are talking, shouting, children are playing, or perhaps squabbling, tools are clanking, animals are shifting and rustling. It's a hive of sound, a stark contrast to the quiet, desolate landscape you just left behind. Your eyes, adjusting from the twilight outside, begin to pick out shapes in the smoky gloom. The longhouse is, as its name suggests, long. And it's packed. Benches or raised platforms line the walls, serving as seating, workspaces, and sleeping areas. People are everywhere, mending fishing nets, weaving cloth, repairing tools, tending to children, simply talking or eating. The air is thick not just with smoke, but with a complex blend of smells. Wood smoke is dominant, of course, but underneath that is the potent aroma of bodies that haven't seen much washing lately, wet wool and leather, cooking food, or perhaps just warming up preserved food, drying hides, and the ever-present smell of the animals who often share the space. It's a pungent, lived-in smell, perhaps off-putting to modern noses, but to someone arriving from the freezing outside, it's the smell of survival, of life persisting against the odds. It's the smell of home, Viking style. Stepping fully inside, you have to navigate around people and possessions. The floor is likely packed earth, perhaps covered with straw or rushes that need changing periodically, and often aren't changed often enough, adding another layer to the olfactory experience. The light is dim, coming primarily from the central fires and perhaps a few small oil lamps or tallow candles, casting flickering shadows that make the corners of the longhouse seem even more mysterious and crowded. It feels less like entering a building and more like entering a living, breathing organism, pulsating with the combined heat and activity of everyone within. Historians still argue whether longhouses were continuously occupied year-round or if some populations dispersed into smaller dwellings during warmer months. But there's little debate that the longhouse served as the primary communal shelter during the harsh northern winter. It was a place designed for collective survival, maximizing shared body heat and centralizing resources like fire and stored food. A quirky tidbit is that the location of the main doorway was sometimes chosen based on prevailing wind direction to minimize drafts, a simple but crucial piece of practical engineering. You might notice that the door often faces south or east, away from the harsher north or west winds common in many Norse regions. The sheer density of life inside is immediately apparent. There's no concept of personal space as you might understand it. People are sitting shoulder to shoulder on the benches, children are underfoot, and off to one side, you can see the dim shapes and hear the soft movements of livestock, sheep, goats, maybe a cow or two, sharing the same roof, separated perhaps by a low partition, but definitely part of the household ecosystem. This wasn't just for convenience. Keeping animals indoors helped keep them alive in brutal temperatures and added their body heat to the overall warmth of the building. It also meant manure was readily available, which, while adding to the smell, was a valuable resource. Imagine trying to sleep with a sheep chewing its cud just a few feet away. It certainly puts modern noise complaints into perspective, doesn't it? You've escaped the cold, but you've entered a world that is loud, smoky, and intensely, unavoidably communal. There's no turning back now. Winter has arrived, and you're here for the duration. So you're standing there, just inside the door, blinking the smoke out of your eyes, feeling the heat wash over you, and maybe trying not to gag on the multi-layered aroma. Now that your initial shock is subsiding slightly, your gaze drifts to the walls around you. They aren't smooth, painted surfaces like you're used to. Oh no. Up close, they look like piles of dirt. Because, in many ways, that's exactly what they are. The basic structure is a timber frame, sturdy posts and beams holding up the roof, but the walls themselves are often built from layers of turf, cut like thick bricks or sods, piled up outside a wattle and daub inner lining, or sometimes making up the entire wall thickness. Imagine cutting rectangles of grass and soil, stacking them up taller than you are, and letting them kind of meld together. That's a turf wall. Simple, right? Almost laughably simple by modern standards. But here's where the odd comfort comes in. That thick, earthy wall of turf and timber is an incredibly effective insulator. It's like wrapping your house in a giant, thick blanket of earth. While the wind howls and the snow piles up outside, those dense walls trap the precious heat generated by the central fire and all those warm bodies, human and animal, huddled inside. Think about how a cave stays a relatively constant temperature year-round. It's a similar principle of using earth mass to buffer against external temperature extremes. A well-built turf wall, sometimes several feet thick at the base, was a formidable barrier against the cold. You might reach out and touch it. It would feel cool and damp to the touch compared to the air inside, but it's holding back temperatures that could freeze you solid in minutes. It's the difference between life and death, contained within those humble, grassy walls. The timber frame provides the necessary structural support, preventing the whole earthy mass from collapsing, especially under the weight of a heavy turf or thatched roof that might also be covered in snow. Sometimes stones were used for the lower courses of the wall, or as foundations, adding stability and preventing damp from rising too much into the turf, although damp was often an unavoidable reality. You might notice patches on the wall where moisture has seeped through, creating darker, richer-looking soil spots. It adds to the earthy smell, certainly, but it's a sign that the wall is doing its job, interacting with the environment. Historians still argue whether the turf walls were always built with a separate inner lining of timber or wattle and daub, or if in some regions the turf was the wall itself, perhaps faced internally with wood. Archaeological evidence varies depending on the location and time period. Some sites show clear evidence of an inner wooden wall alongside the turf, creating a cavity that might have been filled for extra insulation, while others suggest the turf was the primary material, perhaps plastered or simply left as rough earth inside. This variation probably reflects local resources, climate, and building traditions. A quirky tidbit about turf walls is that they were often cut from marshy or boggy ground because the fibrous root systems in such soil held the turf blocks together better. This meant that the material for your walls might literally come from the soggy field right next to where you planned to build. Imagine digging up your house from the ground and stacking it up. It's a very direct connection to the land. It also means that the turf would continue to host a miniature ecosystem for a while. You might even see small plants or roots still visible in the wall structure, a little piece of the outside world surviving inside. Just another reminder that nature was never far away, even within the longhouse walls. These walls weren't just barriers, they were part of the living space. Benches or raised platforms were often built along the inside of the walls, sometimes even integrated into the lower wall structure itself. This is where people sat during the day to work, eat, and socialize, and where they slept at night. So, the wall wasn't just a boundary. It was literally something you leaned against, sat on, and slept beside. You might run your hand along the rough timber, or the slightly crumbly earth of the wall as you settle onto a bench. It's not smooth or clean, but it feels solid, dependable. It feels like shelter. Building a longhouse, especially one with thick turf walls, was a significant undertaking for a community. It required cutting thousands of turf blocks, hauling timber, and coordinating the effort. It wasn't something one family did alone. It was a communal project, binding the people together in the very act of creating their shared winter refuge. And once built, these houses could last for generations, with repairs and additions made over time, becoming integral parts of the landscape and the community's history. Some longhouses were incredibly large, extending for 50, 60, or even 70 meters. That's like 2/3 of a football field, designed to house dozens of people and their animals. Think about the smells again, layered on top of the smoke and bodies and animals. There's the distinct damp, earthy smell of the walls themselves. It's the smell of soil, of roots, of microbial activity. It's a smell that grounds you, literally, to the earth the house is built from. It's probably not a smell you choose for a scented candle today, but in this context, it's the smell of security. It's the smell of knowing that the freezing wind isn't getting through this. And while the walls are effective, they aren't perfect. Drafts could still find their way in, especially around the door and the smoke vents in the roof. And remember that dampness I mentioned? It could be a persistent problem, making the air heavy and cool near the walls, despite the fire in the center. It's a constant battle against the elements, and the longhouse walls are your primary weapon, simple, sturdy, and made of the very ground you stand on. They are the first layer of this odd comfort, the solid, earthy shell protecting you from the deadly beauty of the frozen world outside. Those thick, earthy walls, remember? They're doing their job, holding back the biting cold outside, acting like a giant, well-used blanket. But a blanket only works if there's warmth underneath it. And in the Viking longhouse, that warmth, that lifeblood, pulses from the heart of the building, the fire. Or, more accurately, the hearth. Often, there was a single, long hearth running down the center of the main living space, sometimes just a cleared area on the packed earth floor, sometimes edged with stones. In larger houses, there might be multiple hearths. This wasn't just a fireplace tucked into a wall. It was the central feature, the reason the building existed in this form. Everything revolved around the fire. As you move further into the longhouse, away from the door, the heat intensifies. It radiates outwards from the hearth, a palpable force pushing back the chill that tries to creep in from the edges and the floor. You can feel it warming your face, your hands thawing the last remnants of the outside cold from your clothes. It's a comforting heat, deep and penetrating, unlike the sharp, dry heat of modern heating systems. It's the heat of burning wood, maybe peat, depending on what was available locally. The smell is rich, smoky, and fundamental. It's the smell of warmth itself in this world. Look up, or try to, through the layers of smoke. Directly above the hearth, there would be openings in the roof, louvers or smoke holes, called lyrer in Old Norse, if you were wondering. These were designed, in theory, to let the smoke escape. In practice, well, you've already noticed the air is thick with it. These openings were often the only significant source of light during the day, besides the door, letting in a shaft of dusty, smoky light that would shift and change with the weather outside. At night, the fire itself was the primary illuminator, casting dancing shadows that made the longhouse feel both alive and a little bit spooky. The fire wasn't just for heating and light. It was the kitchen, the workshop, the social hub. Cooking happened over or beside the fire. Pots hung from chains or rested on stones, meat roasted on spits. You might see someone tending a bubbling stew, the aroma of simmering meat and vegetables, maybe roots or dried greens, mingling with the dominant smoke smell. It was also used for drying things, fish, meat, grains, herbs. You might see racks hanging from the roof timbers, laden with things slowly curing in the smoky heat. Wet clothes, boots, and fishing nets would be draped nearby to dry, adding their own steaming scent to the mix. Think of the smell of wet wool drying by a fire. It's very distinctive, isn't it? Now multiply that by 20 people's worth of damp gear. Crafting also centered around the fire. Metalworking might happen near the hearth, with a small forge set up for repairs or making simple tools. Woodworking, bone carving, and other tasks requiring warmth or good light would take place on the benches surrounding the hearth area. The fire was the original multitasker, the central processing unit of the longhouse. It was the heart, yes, but also the stomach, the lungs, sadly, perhaps, and the beating pulse of daily life. The constant presence of smoke was the major downside. It wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a health hazard. Your eyes would sting, your throat would feel scratchy, and breathing that smoky air day in and day out would take its toll over time. It coated everything in a layer of soot, the walls, the timbers, the people's clothes. You'd probably develop a permanent cough, a kind of longhouse hack. Imagine trying to get a good night's sleep with smoke irritating your lungs and tears streaming from your eyes. It makes you appreciate modern ventilation systems, doesn't it? Or maybe just a window you can actually open. Historians still argue whether the smoke holes in the roof were truly effective at venting most of the smoke, or if the longhouse interior was perpetually filled with haze. Archaeological evidence sometimes shows very limited or poorly designed openings, suggesting that inhabitants simply tolerated a high level of smoke as the price of warmth. Some theories suggest that the smoke helped preserve the roof timbers from insects and rot, or even acted as a disinfectant, killing airborne germs, a grim form of air purification, perhaps. But let's be honest, mostly it just made everything smell like a campfire that never goes out. Fuel was a constant concern. Keeping the fire going required a steady supply of wood or peat, which had to be gathered, processed, and stored. This was a major chore, especially in winter when snow covered the ground and fetching fuel meant braving the elements. The fire was a hungry beast, demanding constant feeding. Letting it go out, especially overnight in deep winter, could be disastrous, leading to rapid cooling and potentially frozen pipes. Okay, maybe not pipes, but definitely frozen fingers and toes. A quirky tidbit about the hearth is that its central location and continuous burning made it a focal point for rituals and social gatherings. Stories were told around the fire, oaths were sworn, and important decisions were made in its flickering light. It wasn't just a source of heat, it was a sacred space, a symbol of the family or community gathered within the longhouse. It was the place where the oldest sagas were recited, the flames casting dancing shadows that brought ancient heroes to life for a few hours before sleep. You could say it was the original television, but with better stories and significantly worse picture quality, unless you like everything in shades of orange and black. Fire safety as we know it didn't really exist. The risk of the longhouse catching fire was very real, especially with a constantly burning open hearth, a thatched or turf roof, and lots of flammable materials like straw, dried rushes, and wooden structures. A stray spark could quickly turn the longhouse into a death trap. This was another reason the fire required constant attention, someone always needing to be somewhat aware of it, even while sleeping nearby. It was a necessary danger, a bargain struck with the elements, warmth and light in exchange for smoke and risk. The crackling and popping of the fire would be part of the nighttime soundtrack, alongside snores, animal sounds, and the wind outside. It was a constant reminder of the energy keeping everyone alive. You might lie on your sleeping platform, watching the smoke swirl towards the roof opening, illuminated by the flames, feeling the heat soak into your bones, and know, despite the stinging eyes and the smell, that this smoky, fiery heart was what stood between you and the lethal cold outside. It was uncomfortable, yes, but it was undeniably life. Okay, so you've felt the rush of heat, seen the smoky haze, and heard the low hum of activity. But the sense that truly defines the longhouse experience, the one that wraps itself around you and doesn't let go, is smell. Step further inside, away from the door, and just breathe it in. It's not one smell, but a layered, complex, and frankly, overwhelming symphony of aromas that tells the entire story of winter life under this roof. Dominant, of course, is the wood smoke from the central hearth. It's in your eyes, yes, but it's also deep in your nostrils, coating the back of your throat. It's a constant, acrid, yet strangely comforting presence. It speaks of warmth, of cooking, of life itself. But underneath that smoky veil is everything else. There's the heavy, animal musk of the livestock sharing the space, the sheep, the goats, perhaps the cow. It's the smell of wool, of damp hides, of manure that's probably not being cleaned up as often as you'd like to imagine. It's a potent, earthy, barnyard smell, inescapable and pervasive. Then there are the human smells. Think about being packed in tightly with dozens of other people, many of whom haven't had access to running water or soap for months. The smell of unwashed bodies, of stale sweat, of damp clothing that never quite dries out completely, is a fundamental layer of the longhouse aroma. Add to that the smell of breath, of digestive processes, of everything that comes with close human proximity in an unventilated space. It's intimate. Very, very intimate. You might find yourself subtly trying to breathe through your mouth, but there's no escaping it. It's like a natural repellent for anyone not from the Viking Age, isn't it? You could bottle it and call it Ode to Winter Survival. Mingling with the body and animal odors are the smells of food. Cooking is happening over the fire, so there's the aroma of simmering stews, perhaps made from dried meat or fish, root vegetables, and whatever preserved herbs might be available. There's the smell of baking bread or flatbread on hot stones. But there are also the smells of preserved foods themselves, the sharp, salty tang of dried fish, the rich, cured scent of smoked meats, maybe the slightly sour smell of fermented milk or other preserved dairy. These aren't the fresh, clean smells of modern cooking, they are the deep, concentrated aromas of sustenance painstakingly prepared to last through the lean months. Remember those turf walls we talked about? They add their own distinct note to the symphony. It's the smell of damp earth, of roots, of the ground itself. It's a cool, earthy smell that contrasts with the warm, animal heat in the center of the longhouse. It's the smell of the boundary between inside and out, a constant reminder of the soil that provides both shelter and sustenance. It's a smell that literally grounds you. And then there are the less pleasant smells that inevitably arise when many beings are confined together with limited sanitation. Stale air, waste products, the general detritus of daily life that accumulates over time. It's not something you dwell on, but it's there, a subtle, or not so subtle, undercurrent beneath the more dominant aromas. It adds to the overall impression of a space that is intensely lived in, where everything is recycled and nothing is wasted, including the air quality. The sheer intensity of these smells is difficult for a modern person to fully grasp. Our homes are sealed, ventilated, and filled with air fresheners and cleaning products designed to eliminate or mask natural odors. The longhouse was the opposite. Every smell was amplified, layered, and constantly present. It wasn't just background, it was part of the atmosphere, as tangible as the smoke and the heat. Think about walking into a barn, a smokehouse, and a crowded, sweaty gym all at once, and then imagine living there for months. It's a sensory overload. You know, if you accidentally dropped a modern scented candle in here, it wouldn't stand a chance. The longhouse smells would just swallow it whole. For the people living there, however, these smells were simply the smell of home. They were the smell of survival, of community, of food, and of warmth. They were normalized. You wouldn't notice them with the same conscious awareness that a newcomer like you does. They would be the backdrop of your life, as unremarkable as the air you breathe, which, ironically, is heavily scented with them. It's likely that people developed a high tolerance, or perhaps their sense of smell was simply dulled by the constant exposure. Historians still argue whether the level of cleanliness and air quality varied significantly between longhouses depending on the wealth or customs of the inhabitants. Some archaeological evidence suggests efforts were made to manage waste and refresh bedding, while other findings imply conditions were often quite basic, with floor coverings like straw or rushes being replaced infrequently, allowing odors to build up. It's hard to say definitively how often those rushes were swapped out, but let's just say you probably didn't want to lose your contact lens on the floor. A quirky tidbit about the sensory world of the longhouse is how smell might have played a role in social interactions or even navigation within the dark, smoky space. Perhaps individuals or families had subtle, recognizable scents, beyond the general longhouse smell, due to their work, their diet, or even just their personal body odor. In the dim light and thick smoke, your nose might have been as important as your eyes for identifying who was where or what was happening. It's a reminder of how our senses adapt, and how different environments prioritize different forms of perception. Ultimately, the symphony of smells in the Viking longhouse winter was the olfactory fingerprint of a community huddled together for survival. It was a potent, challenging, but also deeply honest scent profile. It wasn't designed to be pleasant, it was designed to be functional. It was the smell of life persisting against the incredible odds of a northern winter. And as you stand there, letting the complex aroma wash over you, you realize that every single one of those smells, the smoke, the animals, the people, the earth, the food, is a direct result of the sheer density of life packed into this one space. Which brings us to the next unavoidable reality of longhouse living. So, you've felt the heat, you've seen the smoke, you've inhaled the unforgettable aroma blend, and all of that sensory intensity points to one undeniable truth about the longhouse in winter: it is absolutely, utterly packed. Remember the sound you heard from outside? That low roar of activity? Step further inside, and you'll see exactly why it's so loud and so full of smells. You are not entering a spacious hall, you are stepping into a living, breathing, and incredibly crowded ecosystem. Imagine a single, long room, perhaps 50 to 100 feet long. That's like a few modern living rooms end to end. Or even half a basketball court for the really big ones, maybe 20 to 30 feet wide. Now picture dozens of people living in that space. Not just visiting for dinner, but living there, day in and day out, for months on end. Men, women, children, the elderly, everyone who is part of the household or community seeking shelter. They are sitting, standing, working, eating, and eventually, sleeping, all within these same four earthy walls. There is no personal space here, not in the way we understand it today. Your elbow is likely to brush against someone else's as you move. Children are underfoot dogs, if they had them indoors, are weaving between legs, and people are constantly navigating around each other, around tools, around supplies, around the animals. It's a hive of activity, a constant murmur of voices, punctuated by laughter, arguments, the cries of babies, the bleating of sheep, the lowing of cattle. Silence would have been rare, and probably unsettling. The benches or raised platforms that line the walls aren't just for sitting during the day, they are the sleeping areas at night. People would lie down side by side, perhaps sharing rough wool blankets or animal skins for warmth. Think about sleeping in a room with 20, 30, 40 or more other people, all snoring, shifting, coughing, remember that smoke, and generally being present. Privacy was a luxury that simply didn't exist. Everything you did, from eating to working to sleeping, was done in full view and earshot of everyone else. It's the ultimate open-plan living, without any of the trendy minimalist appeal. You couldn't even sneak a midnight snack without potentially waking half the household. This extreme density wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate strategy for survival. The most practical reason, the one you feel immediately upon entering, is heat. Every human body, every animal body, generates heat. Pack them all together in an insulated space, and that collective body heat becomes a significant factor in keeping the temperature up. It's like a giant, multi-species huddle that lasts all winter. The more bodies, the warmer the longhouse. It's a simple, elegant, if slightly pungent, solution to the problem of freezing to death. Beyond the warmth, there was security. Huddling together provided safety in numbers against potential raiders, though less likely in deep winter or wild animals. It also fostered a strong sense of community and mutual reliance. Everyone was literally in the same boat, or longhouse, as it were. Tasks were shared, resources pooled, and the constant proximity meant that everyone knew everyone else's business, for better or worse. Arguments were probably frequent, but so too was cooperation. Historians still argue whether the typical longhouse housed a single extended family group, perhaps including slaves or servants, or if it was more communal, housing several related or unrelated families together. Archaeological evidence and sagas offer different interpretations depending on the region and time period. Some longhouses are so large that they suggest a capacity for 50 to 100 people, far more than a single nuclear family, implying a larger social unit, or perhaps a gathering place for multiple nearby families during the harshest months. Adding to the density were the animals, often housed in a separate section of the longhouse, sometimes simply partitioned off by a low wall, but still under the same roof. We talked about their smell, but think about their physical presence. Sheep, goats, maybe a cow or two, occasionally even pigs or chickens. They added not just heat and smell, but also noise and movement. You could hear them shifting, chewing, occasionally complaining. This wasn't just about keeping them warm. It also made it easier to care for them in bad weather and protected them from predators. It was a practical arrangement, turning your barn into an extension of your living room. Though I doubt they had much luck training the cow not to moo during story time. A quirky tidbit is that the layout of the longhouse, with the central hearth and benches along the walls, might have naturally created zones based on status or family group, even without physical partitions. Those closest to the fire might have been the most important members of the household or those needing the most warmth, like the very young or very old, while others occupied spaces further down the hall. Possessions would have been stored in chests or hung from the roof timbers, maximizing the limited floor and bench space. Every nook and cranny would have been utilized. The sheer lack of private space meant that social norms must have been very different. You couldn't just retreat to your own room. Conflicts had to be managed constantly, and tolerance for others' habits, like snoring, or maybe their terrible singing, must have been high. On the flip side, illness could spread rapidly in such close quarters, a constant danger during the winter months when people were already vulnerable. A cough could quickly become an epidemic under that shared, smoky roof. The floor, remember, is packed earth, likely covered in straw or rushes. This layer, while offering some cushioning and insulation, also quickly became soiled and added to the general aroma. Imagine dozens of people and animals living on a floor covering that isn't changed as often as you'd like. It's another layer of the intense, lived-in reality of the longhouse. Stepping onto it from the relative cleanliness of the outside world, even if the outside world was just snow, would have been stepping into a different sensory environment altogether. Living in such close proximity, sharing air, heat, smells, and sounds with so many others, was the essence of the longhouse winter experience. It was uncomfortable by modern standards, certainly. It was loud, it was smoky, and it smelled like a barn that desperately needed airing out. But it was also warm, it was safe, and it was community. It was survival, achieved not through individual effort, but through collective endurance, packed together tightly against the overwhelming might of the northern winter. You are now fully immersed in the dense, pulsating life of the longhouse, and the winter has only just begun. So you're packed in, shoulder to shoulder, surrounded by the symphony of smells and sounds, feeling the collective heat of dozens of bodies and beasts. And in this dense, pulsating environment, nobody is just sitting around twiddling their thumbs. Winter in the longhouse wasn't a holiday. It was a time of intense, indoor labor, a crucial period for maintenance, crafting, and preparing for the return of warmer weather and the outdoor tasks it would bring. The energy you feel isn't just people existing, it's people working. Look around the crowded benches and floor space. Activity is everywhere. Women are typically gathered together, their hands busy with textiles. You might see someone spinning wool on a drop spindle, the simple weighted stick twirling as they draw out the fibers into thread. Nearby, others are weaving on a warp-weighted loom, a large wooden frame leaning against the wall. It's a slow, rhythmic process, creating the cloth needed for clothing, blankets, and sails. The air in this area might smell faintly of lanolin from the raw wool, adding another layer to the longhouse aroma. Mending is constant. Torn clothes, damaged fishing nets. Even though fishing might be limited in winter, the nets need to be ready, worn-out blankets. Every scrap of fabric, every piece of rope, is valuable and gets repaired until it's beyond saving. It's a cycle of creation and repair, driven by necessity. Men, too, have their indoor tasks. Tool repair is essential. You might see someone sharpening a knife on a whetstone, the scraping sound a counterpoint to the weaving. Axes, hammers, and other implements need constant maintenance. Woodworking is common, carving bowls, spoons, and other utensils, repairing furniture. The benches you're sitting on might need work, or preparing timber for future projects. Bone and antler carving could also happen indoors, creating combs, pins, needles, and decorative items. The fine dust from this work would mingle with the general longhouse grime. Metalworking, while sometimes requiring a separate small forge near the main hearth, or even just outside if possible, also involved indoor finishing and repair work. You might see someone hammering away at a piece of metal, sparks flying briefly near the firelight. Food preparation goes beyond just cooking the daily meal. There's dried meat and fish that need to be prepared, may be pounded or rehydrated. Grains might need to be ground using hand stones, a laborious task that would have been done by various members of the household. Preserved vegetables or herbs need sorting and preparing. Even simple tasks like fetching water, likely from a hole chopped in a nearby frozen stream or well, or managing the fuel for the fire are constant chores. Remember that hungry fire? It needs feeding, and someone has to haul wood or peat and keep it dry enough to burn. Caring for the animals housed within the longhouse is another set of indoor chores. Feeding them requires bringing in stored fodder. Mucking out their section, while probably not a daily deep clean, adding significantly to the smell, as you've noticed, would still need to happen periodically to manage the waste. Milking, if any animals were producing milk, would happen in their section. It's a constant interaction with the livestock, not just sharing space but actively caring for them. Try not to step in anything while you're moving around. It's probably easier said than done. Children weren't exempt from work. From a young age, they would be expected to help with chores suitable for their size, fetching small items, helping with spinning, looking after younger siblings, running simple errands within the longhouse, or helping tend the fire. Life was too demanding for anyone to be idle. It was a collective effort to survive the winter, and everyone contributed according to their ability. It wasn't exactly child labor laws as we know them. Historians still argue whether the division of labor was strictly gendered in all Viking Age communities or if there was more flexibility depending on the specific household and circumstances. While certain tasks like weaving and spinning are often depicted as women's work, and metalworking and heavy carpentry as men's, the harsh realities of winter survival likely meant that everyone pitched in where needed. Perhaps you'd even see someone doing a task traditionally associated with the opposite gender if the situation demanded it. A quirky tidbit is that the constant presence of smoke, while irritating, might have inadvertently helped preserve some of the organic materials used in crafts, like wool and leather, by deterring insects. It also would have coated everything, including the crafts themselves, in a layer of soot. So that beautifully woven piece of cloth might have had a permanent smoky tint and smell to it from the moment it came off the loom. Imagine trying to get that smell out. You'd need a lot more than a single wash cycle. The sheer volume of tasks meant that the longhouse was rarely quiet during the day. The rhythmic thud of the loom, the scrape of a sharpening stone, the tap-tap-tapping of a bone carver, the murmur of conversations, the sounds of animals, the crackling fire, it was a constant soundscape of productivity. Evenings might bring a slight shift towards storytelling or games, which we'll get to, but the underlying hum of small tasks likely continued. Someone always had something that needed mending, preparing, or cleaning. This constant indoor work wasn't just about being productive. It was also a way to pass the time during the long, dark winter days. With limited daylight hours, especially in the northern latitudes, much of life shifted indoors. These tasks provided structure, purpose, and a sense of accomplishment in a season that could otherwise feel bleak and endless. It was a way to keep hands busy and minds engaged, fighting off the boredom and cabin fever that could easily set in when you're confined with the same group of people for months. Just imagine trying to find a quiet corner for 5 minutes of peace when everyone is working and living on top of each other. It simply wasn't an option. The repetitive nature of many of these tasks, spinning, weaving, mending, could be almost meditative, a way to focus and find a rhythm amidst the chaos. It was skill-based work, passed down through generations, essential knowledge for survival. You might find yourself drawn to watch someone expertly working with their hands, shaping wood or weaving intricate patterns, a moment of quiet focus in the bustling longhouse. It's a reminder that even in these seemingly harsh conditions, there was skill, artistry, and dedication to craft. These endless chores, while perhaps monotonous, were the engine that kept the longhouse community functioning, turning raw materials into the necessities of life and ensuring that when spring finally arrived, they would be ready for the world outside. So you've seen the endless tasks that filled the longhouse days, the spinning and weaving, the carving and mending, the constant tending of the fire, and the animals. All of this work is essential, but much of it is ultimately in service of the most fundamental task of all during the winter, eating. Surviving on the food stores painstakingly gathered and preserved during the warmer, more abundant months. Step closer to the hearth, where much of this food preparation happens, and get ready to experience the Viking winter diet firsthand. Forget fresh salads, crisp vegetables, or fruit plucked from a tree. Winter food was, by necessity, food that could last. This meant a heavy reliance on preserved stores, primarily dried, smoked, or salted meat and fish. These methods, simple but effective, were the key to bridging the gap between the harvest season and the return of spring's bounty. The smell of these foods, potent and enduring, is another layer in the longhouse aroma symphony you've become intimately familiar with. It's the smell of survival, concentrated and powerful. Let's talk about fish first. For many coastal or lakeside Viking communities, fish was a staple, and preserving it was absolutely critical. The most common method for long-term storage was drying, particularly air-drying cod and similar white fish. This resulted in what's known as stockfish, fish that has been gutted, split, and hung on wooden racks in the open air to dry until it's rock-hard, like a wooden plank. This process removed almost all the moisture, making it incredibly lightweight and preventing spoilage for years if kept dry. You might see bundles of stockfish hanging from the roof timbers, looking more like building materials than food. Preparing stockfish for eating was a chore in itself, adding another task to the endless winter labor. It was far too hard to simply bite into. It had to be rehydrated by soaking it for a long time, sometimes overnight, or even longer, and then often pounded with a wooden mallet or stone to break down the tough fibers and make it remotely chewable. Imagine spending your evening pounding a piece of fish until your arms ache, just so you can eat it. That's the reality of stockfish. It's a quirky tidbit that this pounding process could take hours for a single meal's worth, turning meal prep into a significant workout. You could probably build some serious bicep strength just getting dinner ready. Meat was also preserved, though perhaps less commonly through simple air drying than fish, depending on the climate. Smoking was a popular method for both meat and fish, giving the food a distinctive flavor and helping to preserve it. Hanging meat or fish from the rafters above the central hearth, where the smoke was thickest, served this purpose perfectly. This constant smoking contributed significantly to the longhouse smell, of course, but it meant that joints of meat or whole fish could last for months. Salting was another option, packing meat or fish in barrels layered with salt, which drew out moisture and inhibited bacterial growth. Salted meat would need to be soaked before cooking to make it palatable, adding another step to the process. The winter diet was likely quite monotonous by modern standards. Day after day, meal after meal, you would be eating variations of dried, smoked, or salted protein. While nutritious, providing essential calories and protein. The flavors would have been intense and repetitive, salty, smoky, perhaps a bit tough or chewy. Fresh food would have been a distant memory, a luxury to look forward to in the spring. What about vegetables and grains? Grains like barley and rye could be stored as flour or as grain, but they were vulnerable to pests and dampness. Root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and parsnips could be stored in root cellars or pits, but their shelf life was limited compared to dried meat and fish. Historians still argue whether root vegetables and grains were effectively stored and formed a significant part of the winter diet, or if meat and fish were the dominant staples, with vegetables and grains being secondary or less reliable sources of nutrition during the deepest winter months. Archaeological evidence of storage pits suggests attempts were made, but the success rate over a long winter is debated. You might have had dried herbs or berries gathered in the summer to add some flavor or variety, but these would have been used sparingly. Preparation of meals around the fire, remember the heart of the longhouse, would involve rehydrating dried foods, simmering stews with preserved ingredients, or perhaps making simple flatbreads on hot stones near the coals. The cooking smells would briefly add a new dimension to the longhouse air, but they were based on the same core ingredients. Imagine the aroma of a stew made with rehydrated stockfish and some dried, salty meat, simmering over a smoky fire. It's probably not going to win any Michelin stars, but it kept you alive. This reliance on preserved food meant that the quality of the diet was heavily dependent on the success of the previous harvest and hunting/fishing seasons. A bad summer could mean a very lean winter, with hunger a constant threat. The stored food wasn't just sustenance, it represented the cumulative effort and success of the community over the past year. Every piece of dried fish, every smoked joint of meat, was a victory against the elements, a tangible sign that they had done enough to prepare. Eating together would have been a central social activity, another moment when the entire longhouse community gathered, sharing the limited resources. You'd sit on the benches, perhaps sharing a common bowl or eating from individual wooden platters, passing around the food. The sheer number of people eating in one space would have amplified the sounds of chewing, slurping, and conversation. It wasn't a quiet, refined dining experience. It was a communal refueling, necessary for survival. The monotony of the diet wasn't just a matter of taste, it could have nutritional implications. While rich in protein and calories, it might have lacked certain vitamins and minerals, potentially leading to health issues over a long winter. Scurvy, caused by lack of vitamin C, was a risk, although some communities might have had access to sources like preserved berries or certain types of seaweed that could help prevent it. It makes you appreciate the simple availability of fresh citrus fruit today, doesn't it? Just peel an orange whenever you want. No such luck in the longhouse. A mainstream historical fact is that the Viking diet relied heavily on preserved foods, particularly dried and smoked fish and meat, to survive the non-growing season in northern latitudes. These methods were essential technologies for enabling large populations to live through harsh winters. The ability to store significant amounts of food was a direct factor in the success and expansion of Norse societies. So, as you sit on the bench, chewing on a piece of rehydrated, pounded stockfish or a bite of salty, smoked meat, washing it down with water or perhaps some weak ale, remember that this is the taste of winter survival. It's not gourmet, it's not varied, and it requires a lot of effort just to get it ready to eat. But it's food, it's fuel, and it's keeping you alive in a world where the alternative is starvation or freezing. It's another facet of the odd comfort of the longhouse, the comfort of knowing there is food, even if it's tough, salty, and tastes strongly of smoke and the sea. So, you're surrounded by the constant buzz of activity, the rhythmic sounds of work, the ever-present smells, and the comforting, if smoky, heat from the fire. The endless chores fill the daylight hours, and the preserved food keeps your belly from growling too loudly. But as the sun dips below the horizon, which happens remarkably early and stays gone for an incredibly long time during a northern winter, the nature of the longhouse activity shifts. The work doesn't necessarily stop entirely. Someone might still be spinning or mending by firelight, but the focus expands to include something vital for mental survival: entertainment. Because when you're packed in like sardines with the same people for months on end, with no Netflix, no radio, and definitely no internet, you need ways to pass those long, dark, seemingly endless nights. The most significant form of evening entertainment, the one that shaped much of what we know about Viking culture, was oral storytelling. This was the age of the sagas. Gathered around the central fire, the flickering light casting dancing shadows on the smoky walls, skilled storytellers, or perhaps just anyone with a good memory and a knack for performance, would recite epic tales. These weren't just bedtime stories. They were the history, mythology, and literature of the Viking world. Tales of gods like Odin and Thor, of legendary heroes and their daring voyages, of ancestors and their feuds and triumphs, of distant lands and epic battles. Listening to sagas was a communal experience, often spanning multiple nights for a single long tale. It was how history and cultural values were transmitted from one generation to the next. Imagine sitting there, feeling the heat of the fire on your face, the smoke stinging your eyes, the sounds of the longhouse fading into the background as you get lost in a world of dragons, giants, and fearless warriors. It was education, history lesson, and blockbuster movie all rolled into one. This oral tradition, the telling and retelling of sagas, was a cornerstone of Viking society, providing a shared identity and connection to the past. Beyond the grand narratives of sagas, there were games. Board games were popular, offering a way to engage the mind and compete without having to brave the freezing world outside. The most famous Viking board game is Nafadaful, often called Viking chess. It's a strategic game played on a checkered board with unequal sides. One player has a king piece and a small group of defenders trying to escape the board, while the other player has a larger army of attackers trying to capture the king. It's a game of strategy and tactics, requiring careful thought. You might see groups huddled around a simple wooden board scratched onto a piece of wood or animal hide, intently focused on their moves, the tension in the air mingling with the smell of stale sweat and smoke. Dice games were also common, simpler games of chance that could lead to quick wins or losses. Imagine the rattle of bone or wooden dice on the packed earth floor or a nearby bench, a sharp sound cutting through the general longhouse din. Gambling was often involved in these games, adding an extra layer of excitement and risk. People might bet small possessions, tools, or even their meager stores of food on the outcome of a dice roll or a board game. It's a quirky tidbit that some archaeological finds include beautifully crafted gaming pieces made of bone, antler, or glass, suggesting that these games were taken seriously and were important enough to warrant fine craftsmanship for the playing pieces. Losing a game might not just mean losing bragging rights. It could mean losing something you genuinely needed to survive the winter, adding a real edge to the competition. You'd have to be careful not to let the intensity of the game make you forget you're still breathing smoky air and sitting next to a potentially smelly sheep. Besides games and sagas, there would have been simpler forms of entertainment. Riddles and verbal puzzles might be posed, challenging quick wits. Perhaps simple songs were sung, though evidence for Viking music is less clear than for their poetry and sagas. Skaldic poetry, complex and often demanding to compose and understand, was certainly a respected art form, and skilled poets, skalds, would have been valued members of a household, providing intellectual entertainment during the long nights. Imagine trying to follow a complex piece of skaldic verse after a long day of pounding stockfish and breathing smoke. It probably required some serious concentration. And of course, simply talking was a major pastime. Sharing news, what little there was in winter, gossiping about neighbors, even within the same longhouse, telling jokes, recounting personal experiences, these everyday interactions filled many hours. In such close quarters, you knew everything about everyone, so the gossip potential was probably immense, though maybe also risky if you weren't careful who you were talking about. It's the original reality show, except everyone is a participant and there's no camera crew, just the constant, unavoidable presence of everyone else. Historians still argue whether the level of formal entertainment, like saga recitation by a dedicated storyteller or complex board games, was common in all longhouses or primarily reserved for the wealthier households or chieftains' halls. It's possible that in smaller or poorer longhouses, evenings were simpler, consisting more of basic tasks, casual conversation, and perhaps less formal storytelling. The archaeological evidence of gaming pieces is scattered, suggesting varying levels of access or interest across different communities. The importance of these activities cannot be overstated. Winter confinement, the relentless cold, the monotonous diet, the constant work, and the lack of privacy could easily lead to despair, depression, and conflict. Sagas provided inspiration and escape, transporting listeners to other times and places. Games offered mental stimulation and a harmless, usually, outlet for competition. Simple social interaction maintained bonds and eased tensions. These forms of entertainment were crucial psychological tools, helping people endure the long, dark months and preventing the cabin fever from boiling over into serious discord. It was a way to break the monotony and remind everyone that there was more to life than just surviving the cold, smoky present. Think about the atmosphere during one of these evenings. The central fire is the only real light source, casting a warm, orange glow that doesn't quite reach the dark, earthy edges of the longhouse. The air is thick with smoke and all the other familiar smells. The sounds of work have mostly subsided, replaced by the murmur of voices, the occasional burst of laughter, the rattle of dice, or the steady, mesmerizing cadence of a saga being recited. You're sitting shoulder to shoulder on a hard wooden bench, perhaps leaning back against the rough turf wall, feeling the cool dampness contrast with the fire's warmth. You might be mending a sock or carving a piece of wood while you listen or play. It's not comfortable in a modern sense. Your eyes sting, the air is heavy, your body aches from the day's work, but there's a different kind of comfort here. The comfort of shared experience, of community, of minds engaged, of hours being filled, slowly but surely, until the blessed light of spring finally returns. These stories and games weren't just pastimes. They were anchors, keeping spirits afloat through the long, dark winter sea. The sagas have wound down, the games are put away, perhaps tucked into a chest near the wall. The fire still glows, but the most intense period of activity is drawing to a close. It's time, finally, for sleep. And in the Viking longhouse winter, sleeping is another uniquely communal experience, perhaps the ultimate expression of that packed in like sardines feeling we talked about earlier. You've spent the day working, eating, and socializing within arm's reach of dozens of others, and now, you'll spend the night just as closely. Your bed isn't a private room with a mattress and pillows. Your bed is likely one of the benches or raised platforms that line the walls of the longhouse. These weren't just seats during the day, they were the designated sleeping areas for the entire household. Imagine a long, wooden platform, maybe a foot or two high, running along the inner wall for many feet. That's where you'll be spending the night. There's no individual space marked out, no walls or curtains for privacy. You simply find your spot alongside everyone else. People would lie down side by side, literally cheek by jowl. There might be rough mattresses stuffed with straw or rushes, remember that floor covering, but often it was just the hard wooden platform itself, perhaps softened slightly by whatever blankets or animal skins you possessed. You'd arrange yourself next to your family members, your fellow workers, maybe even someone you had just been arguing with over a game of Nefatafel. Your personal space shrinks to the dimensions of your own body, plus maybe a few inches on either side. It's the ultimate test of tolerance, and the ability to ignore the constant presence of others. Bedding consisted primarily of wool blankets or animal skins, sheepskins, deerskins, maybe even bearskins for the wealthier or more successful hunters. These weren't laundered frequently, if ever, during the winter, adding yet another layer to the longhouse's complex aroma. They would absorb the smells of smoke, bodies, and animals, becoming heavier and more pungent over time. Imagine snuggling up under a blanket that smells faintly, or strongly, of campfire, wet dog, and several months of accumulated human presence. It's not exactly fresh linen, is it? But it was warm, or at least warmer than trying to sleep without it. Finding a comfortable position must have been a challenge. You're lying on a hard surface, pressed against other people, with the constant background noise of the longhouse. Snoring would have been a symphony. Coughing, too, given the smoky air. Animals in their section would shift, rustle, maybe let out an occasional bleat or moo. children would cry or fidget. And then there's the sheer physical presence of so many bodies. Trying to roll over without elbowing your neighbor or falling off the platform would require careful maneuvering. It makes you appreciate having a whole modern bed to yourself, doesn't it? You could do jumping jacks in your sleep and not bother anyone. The temperature gradient within the longhouse was also a factor in sleeping arrangements. The areas closest to the central hearth would be the warmest, but also the smokiest and potentially the noisiest. The platforms along the walls, while benefiting from the insulation of the turf and timber, would be cooler and potentially damp. There might have been a subtle competition for the warmer spots near the fire, perhaps based on status or need. The very young, the elderly, or the ill might have priority. Sleeping further from the fire meant colder air, but maybe slightly less smoke stinging your eyes. It was a trade-off between warmth and air quality. Privacy, as you've probably gathered by now, was non-existent. There were no partitions, no separate rooms, not even curtains. Everything happened in the open. Getting dressed, changing clothes, infrequently, one assumes, dealing with bodily functions, likely requiring a trip outside, even in the cold, or using a designated area that added to the smell inside, it all happened in full view or earshot of everyone else. There were probably strong social norms about ignoring certain things, a collective agreement to pretend you didn't see or hear everything happening around you. But it would take a level of desensitization that's hard for us to imagine. It's the ultimate argument against open-plan living. This lack of privacy and constant proximity could certainly breed conflict, but it also reinforced the sense of community. You were literally sharing space and warmth with your household. Mutual reliance wasn't just a concept, it was a physical reality you felt every night as you huddled together for warmth. If someone was restless, sick, or having a nightmare, it affected everyone nearby. There was no escaping the collective experience. It fostered a kind of forced empathy. You couldn't help but be aware of the well-being, or lack thereof, of the people sleeping inches away from you. Historians still argue whether dedicated sleeping platforms were present in all longhouses or if people sometimes simply slept on the floor near the hearth, perhaps on layers of straw and hides. Archaeological evidence varies between sites, suggesting that building practices and internal layouts differed depending on the region, time period, and the wealth of the inhabitants. Some longhouses show clear evidence of raised wooden platforms, while others have less defined sleeping areas. A mainstream historical fact is that communal sleeping arrangements were common in many cultures throughout history, not just Viking-age Scandinavia, as a way to conserve heat and space, especially in colder climates or less affluent societies. The idea of individual bedrooms and privacy is a relatively recent development. A quirky tidbit about Viking sleep is the potential presence of unwelcome bedmates. Lice and other parasites were a constant reality of life in close quarters with limited hygiene. Sleeping cheek by jowl would have made the spread of such creatures incredibly easy. You might spend part of your night scratching, or perhaps even trying to pick lice from your hair or clothing by firelight before settling down. It adds another layer of awe to the comfort of sharing body heat. Sweet dreams, don't let the bedbugs. Well, you get the picture. Despite the discomforts, the hard surface, the smells, the noise, the lack of privacy, the potential parasites, there was a fundamental comfort in this shared sleep. It was the comfort of collective warmth, of not being alone in the face of the crushing winter darkness and cold. You were part of a huddle, a living mass generating enough heat to keep everyone alive. The sounds of others, while sometimes irritating, were also the sounds of life, of survival. You weren't isolated, you were connected, physically and existentially, to the people around you. As you lie there, trying to get comfortable on the hard bench, pulling a scratchy wool blanket up to your chin, you can feel the warmth radiating from the bodies pressed against yours. You can hear the rhythmic breathing, the occasional snore, the distant rustle of animals. The smoke from the fire hangs in the air, less dense now that fewer people are awake and moving, but still present. The firelight flickers and fades, leaving long stretches of mere darkness. It's not the peaceful, solitary sleep you might be used to. It's rough, it's crowded, it's noisy, and it smells. But it's also warm, it's safe, and it's the only way to survive the night. You close your eyes, hoping the combined heat and exhaustion will be enough to carry you into sleep, surrounded by the quiet, and not so quiet, breathing of the dozens of souls sharing your winter refuge. So, you've finally settled down on your bench, nestled amongst your longhouse companions, feeling the collective warmth radiating around you. You've pulled your scratchy-wool blanket or animal skin up, trying to find a comfortable spot on the hard surface. The sounds of the longhouse are settling too, the crackling fire, the occasional snore, the soft movements of the animals. You close your eyes, exhausted from the day's work and the sheer sensory input of this place. But just as you start to drift off, you feel it. A tiny, irritating prickle. Then another. And another. Ah, yes. The unseen inhabitants of the longhouse. Living in such close proximity, with limited opportunities for thorough cleaning of bodies, clothing, or bedding, meant that you were never truly alone. You shared your space, your heat, your food, and inevitably your parasites. Lice were the most common and persistent problem. Tiny creatures that thrived in the thick wool clothing and the warmth generated by closely packed bodies. Head lice, body lice, maybe even pubic lice. All were likely unwelcome companions in the longhouse winter. Imagine that constant, low-grade itch, a persistent distraction that no amount of scratching seemed to truly alleviate. It wasn't just an occasional annoyance. It was a fundamental, irritating reality of daily life. Sleeping was often interrupted by the need to scratch, trying to find some temporary relief in the dark. Itchy fingers would become a familiar sensation, almost a constant tick. Beyond lice, fleas were also likely present, particularly given the close quarters with animals. The straw and rushes covering the floor, while providing some insulation and cushioning, also offered a perfect habitat for various small creatures. And while less likely to be a constant irritant in the same way as lice, the occasional bite or crawl of something unseen would be a regular, unpleasant surprise. It makes you appreciate modern insecticides and laundry detergent, doesn't it? A hot wash cycle and some flea powder would feel like magic in this world. Dealing with these persistent invaders was a chore in itself, adding another item to the already long list of daily tasks. There was no effective shampoo or body wash as we know it. Cleaning involved water, which was often cold and difficult to fetch in winter, and perhaps some form of lye soap, which could be harsh on the skin and might not be readily available or effective against stubborn infestations. The primary method for dealing with lice was manual removal. You might see people sitting together by the firelight, meticulously combing through each other's hair or examining seams in clothing, picking out lice and nits, eggs. It was a communal grooming activity, a necessary evil that reinforced the lack of privacy and the shared struggle against these tiny foes. It's a quirky tidbit that special fine-toothed combs made of bone, antler, or would have been found in Viking-age archaeological sites, specifically designed for removing lice and nits from hair. These combs are a tangible reminder of just how common and accepted this problem was. Trying to clean clothing was also difficult. Thick woolens were hard to wash and slow to dry, especially in a damp, smoky environment. Remember that constant smell of wet wool drying by the fire? That was a common occurrence, but it didn't mean the clothes were clean, just dry. Heat could kill lice and eggs, but effectively heating clothing or bedding to a high enough temperature without damaging it or setting the longhouse on fire would have been a challenge. Perhaps items were occasionally placed near the fire, or even briefly exposed to intense cold outside, though the effectiveness of the latter is debated. Historians still argue whether the levels of hygiene and resulting parasite infestations varied significantly between different longhouses or social classes. While some archaeological evidence suggests that Viking-age people did engage in practices like bathing, though perhaps less frequently in winter, and using combs, the reality of communal living with animals and limited resources likely meant that parasites were a widespread issue regardless of status. It's probable that everyone in the longhouse, from the highest status individual to the lowest servant, shared the same itchy fate. You couldn't buy your way out of a louse problem when everyone was living in the same giant wool sweater. The constant irritation wasn't just uncomfortable. It could also lead to skin infections from scratching, and body lice are known vectors for diseases like typhus, although the prevalence of such diseases in Viking-age Scandinavia is debated and hard to confirm archaeologically. So, these tiny invaders weren't just annoying, they were a potential health risk, adding another layer of vulnerability to the already challenging winter survival. It was a constant, low-level battle against an enemy you could barely see, but whose presence you felt acutely, day and night. Imagine trying to focus on a complex saga or a strategic game of Nafataful when your scalp is crawling. It would require a certain level of mental discipline, or perhaps just complete exhaustion, to ignore the persistent itching. It was a constant, physical reminder of the realities of your environment, the lack of modern comforts and sanitation. It was a part of the background noise of the longhouse, not a sound you could hear, but a sensation you could feel, always present beneath the warmth, the smells, and the sounds of human and animal life. The shared nature of the infestation meant that if one person had lice, everyone was likely to get them eventually. There was no isolating the problem. It was a collective burden, another way in which the longhouse enforced community, albeit in a rather unpleasant fashion. You were literally sharing your skin and your clothes with the same microscopic population. It's a stark contrast to modern ideas of personal hygiene and avoiding contact with pests. In the longhouse, you made peace with them, or at least learned to live with the constant irritation they caused. It's a very specific kind of discomfort, one that gets under your skin, quite literally. The fact that people bothered to make and use specialized combs for lice removal, and that these combs are found relatively frequently in graves, underscores how common and persistent this issue was. It wasn't a secret shame. It was a fact of life that required practical measures, however ineffective they might seem to us today. It was just another part of the daily routine: wake up, tend the fire, eat preserved food, work, pick lice, try to sleep, repeat. It adds a very earthy, very human layer to our picture of Viking life, reminding us that even the most fearsome warriors likely spent time scratching their heads. It's a humbling thought, isn't it? So, as you lie there on your hard bench, feeling that familiar prickle, you can add the sensation of being a walking buffet for tiny parasites to the list of longhouse experiences. It's uncomfortable, it's irritating, and it's utterly inescapable. But it's also a sign of life, of bodies huddled together, generating enough warmth to sustain not just humans and animals, but a whole ecosystem of smaller beings. It's just another layer of the odd, challenging, and undeniably real comforts of the Viking longhouse winter. And while you might not sleep soundly because of the itching, you are, at least, warm and not alone in your discomfort. You've felt the persistent itch of the unseen invaders, a constant reminder that you share your warmth not just with people and livestock, but with a whole ecosystem of tiny creatures. And as you scratch, subtly you hope, though everyone else is probably doing it too, your eyes, accustomed now to the smoky gloom, pick out movement near the central hearth. It's the younger members of the longhouse community, the children. Life under this crowded, smoky, itchy roof wasn't just for adults. It was the entire world for Viking children during the long winter months. Imagine being a child in this environment. Your home is one long, bustling room. Your playground is the limited space on the packed earth floor or the benches. Your playmates are your siblings, cousins, and the children of the other families or individuals sharing the longhouse. There's no escaping them, just as there's no escaping the smoke or the smell of wet sheep. From a very young age, children were integrated into the daily life and labor of the longhouse. They weren't segregated into nurseries or playrooms. They were simply there, part of the constant flow of activity. You'd see toddlers toddling near the benches, older children chasing each other, carefully, one hopes, given the fire and tools, and teenagers already participating in the adult chores. Their childhoods were likely far shorter, in the modern sense, than ours. From a surprisingly early age, children were expected to contribute to the household's survival. We talked about the endless chores. Well, children had their version of these. Smaller hands could be useful for fetching and carrying, for helping with spinning, for sorting dried berries or herbs, for watching younger siblings, or for helping to tend the fire, under supervision, hopefully. They would learn skills by observation and imitation, watching the adults weave, carve, mend, and cook. The longhouse was their schoolhouse, the adults their teachers, and survival the curriculum. There was no formal education in reading or writing for most children. Their learning was practical, hands-on, and essential for their future roles in society. Imagine learning how to make rope or mend a fishing net by the age of 7, skills that might seem basic to us, but were critical for survival. Even their play was often imitative of adult life. They might use small tools to carve scraps of wood, mimicking the adults' woodworking. They might play with miniature versions of weapons or boats, practicing skills they would need later. Dolls made of wood or bone have been found in archaeological sites, suggesting imaginative play was part of their lives, even if the setting was a smoky, crowded longhouse. Games like Nafatafu, which we mentioned earlier, were played by people of all ages, so children would likely have learned these strategic games from watching and participating with adults or older siblings. It wasn't just about fun. It was about developing critical thinking and strategic skills needed in a world that often demanded sharp wits. It's a quirky tidbit that some of the smaller, less elaborate gaming pieces found by archaeologists might actually have belonged to children. The constant presence of children added another layer to the longhouse soundscape. Their laughter and shouts would mingle with the adult voices and animal sounds. Their squabbles would occasionally punctuate the relative calm. Their presence meant that the adults always had to be somewhat mindful of where little bodies were in relation to the fire, sharp tools, or hot cooking pots. It added an element of cheerful, and sometimes not so cheerful, chaos to the already packed space. Imagine trying to concentrate on a complex weaving pattern with a toddler trying to climb onto your lap or an older child running past, narrowly avoiding tripping over the loom weights. It would require a level of patience that modern parents might struggle to find in such conditions. Historians still argue whether Viking childhood was universally harsh and focused solely on labor, or if there was more room for play and nurturing depending on the family's status and the child's individual temperament. While sagas often depict children participating in work and facing hardships, archaeological evidence of toys and games suggests that play was also an important part of their development. It's likely a combination of both. Children were expected to work, but they also found moments for play and creativity within the constraints of their environment. Life wasn't all work and no play, even in a longhouse winter. The longhouse environment itself presented unique challenges and experiences for children. Growing up surrounded by smoke and animals, breathing that air constantly, would have been their normal. They would have been used to the smells, the sounds, the lack of privacy from birth. Their resilience to these conditions, which seem so harsh to us, would have been built into their very being. They would have learned to navigate the crowded space, to be aware of the dangers, like the fire, and to find their place within the social structure of the household from their earliest years. Their immune systems, one imagines, would have been robust, though they would also have been vulnerable to the rapid spread of illness in such close quarters, as we discussed. A mainstream historical fact is that children in Viking-age societies, like most pre-industrial societies, were generally expected to contribute to the household economy from a young age, and their education was primarily practical and vocational, learned through participation in daily tasks alongside adults. There wasn't a concept of a protected, extended childhood purely for learning and play as in modern times. The winter nights, filled with sagas and games, would have been particularly magical for children. Gathered around the fire, listening to tales of gods and heroes, their imaginations could soar beyond the smoky confines of the longhouse. These stories were more than entertainment. They were lessons in courage, honor, and the values of their culture. They were the foundation of their understanding of the world and their place in it. Imagine the wide-eyed wonder of a child hearing about Thor battling giants for the first time, the firelight making the shadows dance like the very creatures in the story. It was probably more engaging than any modern cartoon, even if the viewing conditions were significantly worse. Even the less pleasant aspects of longhouse life were part of their experience. The constant itching from lice was just a normal part of being alive. The smell of animals and smoke was just the smell of home. They wouldn't have known any different. It puts a whole new spin on. Kids these days don't know how good they have it. Doesn't it? Trying to explain central heating or individual bedrooms to a Viking kid would probably sound like the most outlandish saga ever told. Life for children in the Viking longhouse winter was a blend of work and play, learning and contribution. It was a childhood lived in constant proximity to adults and animals, in an environment that demanded resilience and adaptation. They were integral members of the community, their presence adding to the warmth and life of the longhouse, their future representing the continuation of their society. They were the next generation who would learn to navigate the frozen world outside and carry on the traditions of their ancestors, forged in the smoky, crowded heart of the winter longhouse. So, you've navigated the crowded benches, seen the children integrated into the daily grind, felt the incessant itch of the longhouse's smallest residents, and maybe even tried to pick a louse or two yourself. And as you settle back down, perhaps trying to find a slightly less itchy spot on your bench, your attention drifts towards the far end of the longhouse, or maybe just the section set slightly apart. Because sharing this space with humans isn't the full story of winter life under this roof. You are also sharing it with the barnyard. Yes, that constant rustling sound you hear, the occasional bleat, the lowing, the distinct pong of animal musk layering itself over the smoke and human smells? That's the livestock. In many, though not all, Viking longhouses, particularly in the colder regions, a section of the building was dedicated to housing the animals during the brutal winter months. This wasn't a separate barn a short walk away. It was literally under the same roof, often separated from the human living area by nothing more than a low partition or a change in floor level. Think of it as a combined house and barn, a single structure designed to keep everything and everyone vital for survival together. Why would you want to live with your sheep and cows? The primary reason, the one you feel radiating through the building, is warmth. Animals, like humans, generate body heat. Pack a dozen or more sheep, a couple of cows, maybe some goats or even pigs into one end of an insulated building, and their combined body heat becomes a significant factor in raising the overall temperature of the longhouse. It's like having a very large, very smelly, very effective biological heating system running 24/7. In temperatures that could drop far below freezing outside, that extra warmth was absolutely critical for human comfort and, more importantly, for animal survival. A frozen cow is not a happy prospect when your survival depends on its milk, meat, and hide. It's the ultimate form of cohabitation for mutual thermal benefit. Beyond warmth, there was protection. Keeping valuable livestock indoors protected them from predators, wolves, bears, or even human rustlers, who might be prowling in the winter landscape. It also protected the animals from the worst of the weather itself, shielding them from blizzards, ice, and biting winds that could kill them if they were left exposed. It was a secure, albeit crowded, sanctuary for the animals when the outside world was actively hostile. Imagine trying to round up a flock of sheep during a whiteout. It's much easier if they're just down the hall. Ease of access was another practical consideration. With deep snow or icy conditions outside, getting to a separate barn to feed, water, or milk the animals would have been a difficult and potentially dangerous chore. Having them under the same roof meant these essential tasks could be performed without having to brave the elements. You could feed the sheep their stored hay or fodder, check on the cow, or collect milk, if any were lactating in winter, which wasn't always the case depending on breeding cycles and feed, all from the relative warmth and safety of the longhouse interior. It turned a potentially hazardous outdoor journey into a simple walk down the hall. Though you still had to watch where you stepped. Of course, sharing your home with farm animals came with significant downsides. The smell, which we've already discussed, was perhaps the most obvious. The combined aromas of animal bodies, wet wool, and manure were a constant, potent presence, layering themselves over the smoke, human odors, and cooking smells. It was simply part of the longhouse atmosphere. The noise was another factor. Animals aren't silent roommates. There would be chewing, snorting, bleating, lowing, and the general sounds of them shifting and settling, particularly at night. It added another layer to the already complex soundscape of the longhouse, making it even harder to find true quiet. It makes you think twice about complaining about a noisy upstairs neighbor, doesn't it? At least they probably aren't a cow. Historians still argue whether housing animals within the longhouse was a universal practice across all Viking Age Scandinavia or if it varied significantly by region, climate, and the wealth or specific needs of the household. Archaeological evidence of animal stalls within longhouses is found in some areas, particularly Iceland and parts of Norway, where winters were harshest, but is less common in others like Denmark or Sweden. This suggests regional adaptations to local conditions and building traditions. The layout of the animal section could vary. Sometimes it was simply one end of the longhouse, with the human area at the other, and the hearth in between, creating a temperature gradient. A low wall or wooden partition might separate the two zones, or sometimes the animal area was slightly lower than the human living space. Manure would accumulate in the animal section, providing not only heat but also a valuable resource that could be collected later for fertilizing fields when spring arrived. This added another layer of practicality. Your heating system was also producing fertilizer. Efficiency, Viking style. Though clearing it out must have been one of the least pleasant chores imaginable. Imagine the smell when that happened. A mainstream historical fact is that the practice of housing livestock within the main dwelling, known as byrdwelling or longhouse barns, was a common feature in many parts of northern Europe with cold climates, including Viking-age Scandinavia, because it provided essential warmth and protection for the animals during winter. A quirky tidbit is that the specific layout and size of the animal section might even indicate the status or wealth of the household, with richer families potentially housing more or different types of animals within the longhouse compared to poorer ones. The number and health of your livestock were a direct measure of your wealth and ability to survive. So, the more animals you had snoring next to you, the richer you probably were, and the warmer you definitely were. Living so closely with animals also meant a constant interaction with them. Children would grow up familiar with them, perhaps helping to care for them. You would see them daily, hear them constantly, smell them always. They were part of the household ecosystem, not just livestock but co-inhabitants of your winter refuge. It blurred the lines between human and animal space in a way that is almost unimaginable in modern Western societies. It was a practical necessity, a survival strategy born of harsh conditions, turning your home into a true, multi-species longhouse. It wasn't luxurious, it wasn't always pleasant, but it was undeniably functional, helping both people and animals endure the long, dark, frozen months together. And it adds a very specific, very earthy flavor to the odd comforts of this unique winter sanctuary. You've acclimatized, mostly, to the smoky air, the layered smells, the constant hum of activity, and the close proximity of dozens of humans and their animal co-inhabitants. You've even started to accept the low-grade itch that's now just part of the background radiation of longhouse life. But in this dense, pulsating organism of shared existence, who is guiding the ship? Who makes the decisions, settles the inevitable squabbles, and ensures that this crowded, multi-species household functions well enough to survive the winter? This brings us to the social structure and leadership within the longhouse walls. At the head of the longhouse community was typically the husbandi, or husbandi, the master of the house, the free man who owned or managed the farm and its resources. He was the patriarch, responsible for the well-being and survival of everyone under his roof, his family, any hired laborers, servants, and potentially even thralls, slaves. His authority was significant, particularly in matters concerning the farm, trade, legal issues, and relations with other households or the wider community. He would likely occupy a place of prominence on the central bench near the fire, a physical reflection of his status. You might see him overseeing tasks, discussing matters with other adults, or perhaps presiding over the evening saga telling. However, the husbandi wasn't the sole authority. Within the domestic sphere, the husfrige, or husfrige, the mistress of the house, held considerable power and responsibility. She managed the household economy, overseeing the preparation and storage of food, the production of textiles and clothing, the care of the sick, and the daily running of the longhouse. Her domain was everything within the walls, and maybe a bit beyond. In a place where indoor life was paramount for months on end, the husfrige's role was absolutely critical. She was the one who ensured the fire was kept, the food stores were managed efficiently, the clothing was mended, and the general order of the crowded living space was maintained, as much as possible. Imagine trying to keep track of dozens of people, animals, and all their needs in this environment, it required immense skill and authority. It's a mainstream historical fact that Viking-age women, particularly the mistresses of large households, held significant power and autonomy within their domestic sphere, managing complex operations that were vital for survival. Decisions within the longhouse, especially those affecting the daily routine or the allocation of resources, might have been made through a combination of the husbandi's ultimate authority and the husfrida's domain-specific power, often in consultation with other adult members of the household, particularly older family members or trusted servants. In a space where everyone was so close, open communication, or at least, very audible communication, and negotiation were likely necessary to prevent constant friction. Arguments, as you might expect when dozens of people are confined together with limited privacy and constant smells, were probably frequent. Resolving these disputes, maintaining harmony, and ensuring cooperation were ongoing challenges for the household heads. Perhaps minor disagreements were aired publicly and settled quickly, while more serious issues required the intervention of the husbandi or husfrida. You certainly couldn't storm off to your room to cool down. Your room was a bench shared with several other people. The rest of the longhouse inhabitants fit into this hierarchy. There were likely adult children and their spouses, perhaps grandparents, who would hold respected positions based on age and kinship. Then there were potentially free laborers or servants, *hoskarla*, or vingemen, who worked for the husbandi in exchange for food, shelter, and clothing. Their status was lower than free family members, but they were still free individuals. At the bottom of the social ladder were the thralls, ***, enslaved individuals acquired through raiding, trade, or debt. Thralls performed the hardest and most unpleasant labor, fetching water in freezing conditions, mucking out the animal section, definitely a thrall's job, you imagine, given the smell, processing raw materials, and other demanding tasks. Their lives were harsh, and their presence added another layer to the social dynamics within the longhouse, a stark reminder of the inequalities that existed even in this close-knit survival unit. The division of labor we discussed earlier, the spinning and weaving, the carving, the cooking, the animal care, was often tied to status and gender, but the harsh realities of winter meant some flexibility was probably necessary. Everyone had a role to play, from the smallest child helping with chores to the husbandi making sure there was enough fuel for the fire. The longhouse functioned like a small, self-sufficient economy, and everyone was a necessary part of the machine. It wasn't just about individual survival, it was about the collective. Your ability to contribute directly impacted the well-being of the entire group. Imagine trying to slack off when everyone else is working inches away from you, constantly aware of who is doing what. Peer pressure was probably a very effective motivator. Historians still argue whether the composition of a typical longhouse community was primarily based on kinship, housing a single large extended family, or if it was more of an economic unit, bringing together unrelated free people and thralls under the authority of a wealthy husbandi. Archaeological evidence and sagas offer different pictures, suggesting regional variations and changes over time. Some longhouses are so large they imply a congregation of several families or a chieftain's retinue, while others seem sized for a single large family group. A quirky tidbit about the social structure is the potential for upward mobility, even for thralls. Some sagas tell of thralls who gained their freedom through loyal service or by earning enough to buy themselves out of bondage. While likely rare, especially in the depths of winter when opportunities were limited, the possibility existed, adding a tiny flicker of hope for those at the very bottom of the social hierarchy. Imagine a thrall dreaming of the day they could leave the manure-filled end of the longhouse and sit closer to the fire as a free person. The sheer lack of privacy meant that social interactions were constant and unavoidable. There was no escaping your fellow longhouse dwellers, their habits, their moods, or their opinions. Learning to navigate these complex relationships, to manage conflict, and to cooperate effectively was as essential for survival as having enough food or fire. The social skills developed in the longhouse, negotiation, compromise, tolerance, especially for snoring and scratching, would have been finely tuned. It was a crash course in communal living, with very high stakes. The authority of the husbandi and husfrige wasn't absolute tyranny. There were social norms, expectations, and the potential for individuals to leave and seek their fortune elsewhere, though not in the middle of winter. Reputational concerns and the need to maintain a functional household would have placed limits on arbitrary rule. It was a system based on responsibility as much as authority. The leaders were responsible for the survival of everyone in their care. If they failed, the consequences were dire for the entire group. So, as you observe the flow of activity, the quiet interactions, the occasional sharp word, you begin to understand the invisible threads of authority, kinship, and necessity that bind this crowded community together. The husbandi and husfrige are the anchors, guiding the household through the long winter night, relying on the contributions and, mostly, peaceful coexistence of everyone under their smoky roof. It's a complex, often challenging social environment, but like everything else in the longhouse, it's designed for one purpose: ensuring that when spring finally arrives, the community is still intact and ready to face the world again. It's another essential piece of the puzzle, adding a layer of human dynamics to the odd comforts of this winter sanctuary. You've navigated the complex social web of the longhouse, seen the different roles people play, and felt the invisible lines of authority and kinship that keep the community functioning. You understand that this crowded, smoky, smelly, itchy, warm space is a universe unto itself, a bubble of life against the overwhelming force of the northern winter. But for all the self-sufficiency and indoor activity, the longhouse isn't entirely sealed off from the world outside. Sometimes you simply have to go out there. And stepping outside the longhouse in the depths of winter is not a casual decision, it is a serious undertaking, a stark reminder of just how hostile the environment truly is. Imagine the preparation. Inside, you're in layers of wool and leather, perhaps even furs. You're warm, maybe a little too warm, breathing air thick with smoke and the scent of dozens of bodies and animals. To go outside, you need to add more layers, bundling up against temperatures that can kill quickly. More wool tunics, thick leggings, sturdy boots wrapped perhaps with extra cloth or straw for insulation. A heavy cloak, likely wool, perhaps lined with fur or sheepskin, pulled tight around your shoulders. A hood or cap to cover your head and ears, maybe even a scarf or piece of cloth pulled up over your face to protect against the biting wind and ice crystals. You might tie ropes around your waist or legs to keep the snow from getting in. It's a process of encasement, transforming yourself from a longhouse dweller into a walking, bundled shape designed purely for survival against the cold. It takes time, effort, and a mental bracing for the shock to come. It's not like just grabbing your coat and popping out to the shop. This is preparing for potential battle against the elements. You approach the heavy wooden door, the one that felt so welcoming on arrival. It's a barrier now, holding back not just the cold, but a different reality. You push it open, and the contrast is immediate and brutal. The warmth you were just luxuriating in vanishes instantly, replaced by air that feels like needles pricking your skin. The dense, smoky air of the longhouse is ripped away by a wind that seems to carry the very essence of ice. Your lungs seize up for a moment, shocked by the sudden, freezing intake. The air outside is thin, sharp, and clean compared to the longhouse interior, but it's lethally cold. It makes the smoky air inside feel almost pleasant in comparison, doesn't it? Like choosing between being lightly choked and instantly flash frozen. And the light. If it's daytime, the snow-covered landscape outside is blindingly bright under the often low sun, or even just the diffuse light of an overcast sky. The whiteness stretches out, vast and featureless, reflecting what little light there is. If it's night, the darkness is profound, broken only by the stars, if visible, and perhaps the faint glow from the longhouse door behind you. The wind howls, whipping snow into drifts, erasing paths, making visibility poor. The familiar sounds of the longhouse are swallowed up by the roar of the wind and the crunch of snow underfoot. You are suddenly very, very small in a very, very large and unforgiving world. Why would anyone brave this? Necessity. Even with careful planning, the longhouse community wasn't entirely self-sufficient without venturing outside. Fuel for the fire, that absolute heart of the longhouse, was a constant need. Wood or peat had to be fetched from storage piles, which might be some distance from the house, or occasionally even gathered from frozen forests if stores ran low. Water was essential for drinking, cooking, and basic cleaning, however infrequent. Fetching it meant going to a nearby stream or well, chopping a hole in the thick ice, and hauling heavy buckets back through the snow. It was backbreaking, freezing work, and the risk of falling on the ice or into the water was very real. Imagine trying to carry 2 full buckets of water across a slippery, uneven, snow-covered surface in a howling blizzard. It was not for the faint of heart. Checking traps or snares set for small game might also require venturing out, hoping to supplement the monotonous diet of preserved food. Sometimes, if desperate, hunting larger game might be attempted, though this was incredibly difficult and dangerous in deep winter. Basic maintenance of the longhouse exterior might be needed, clearing snow from the roof to prevent collapse, or reinforcing a section of wall damaged by the wind. These tasks were unavoidable, despite the dangers. It's a mainstream historical fact that despite relying heavily on stored resources, Viking-age communities in northern latitudes still needed to perform essential outdoor tasks like fetching water and fuel throughout the winter to survive. Their survival wasn't just about hoarding, it was also about enduring. The dangers outside were numerous. Frostbite could set in quickly, freezing fingers, toes, nose, and ears in minutes if not adequately protected. Hypothermia was a constant threat. Getting wet, whether from snow, ice, or falling into water, could be a death sentence as the body rapidly lost heat. Getting lost in a whiteout or the featureless darkness was a real possibility, even near the longhouse. Predatory animals, hungry in the lean winter months, might pose a threat, though humans traveling in groups and making noise were less likely targets. The sheer physical exertion of moving through deep snow could lead to exhaustion, making you even more vulnerable to the cold. Every step outside the warmth of the longhouse was a calculated risk. Historians still argue whether specialized winter clothing was standardized or varied greatly depending on the wealth and resources of the household. While wool and animal skins were universally used, the quality, thickness, and layering techniques might have differed significantly, impacting how well individuals could withstand the cold. Some archaeological finds suggest layered clothing and specific designs aimed at trapping heat, but the extent to which this was universally effective is debated. A quirky tidbit is that in some communities, they might have marked paths to essential resources like the water source or fuel storage with poles or piles of stones so people didn't get lost during blizzards or in the dark. These simple markers were literally lifelines, guiding people back to the safety of the longhouse through the disorienting white or blackness. Imagine relying on a few sticks in the snow to keep you from wandering off and freezing to death. It adds a whole new layer of appreciation for GPS, doesn't it? Or even just streetlights. The contrast between the interior and exterior of the longhouse was perhaps never more apparent than during these necessary trips outside. Inside, it was crowded, loud, smoky, and full of life. Outside, it was vast, quiet, except for the wind, clean, and potentially deadly. The longhouse was a cocoon, protecting you from the harsh reality that lay just beyond the door. Stepping back inside after fetching water or fuel would have been an immense relief, the sudden rush of warmth feeling like a physical embrace, the familiar smells and sounds a comforting return to the world of the living. You would shed your outer layers, shaking off the snow and ice, and rejoin the bustling community, profoundly grateful for the smoky, crowded, warm refuge. These brief excursions into the frozen world outside were a constant reminder of what the longhouse was protecting you from. They underscored the value of the communal heat, the stored food, the shared tasks, and the simple fact of being alive together within those earthy walls. They made the discomforts inside seem minor compared to the existential threat outside. You might complain about the smoke, or the smells or the itching, but you wouldn't trade it for the silence and the cold of the world beyond the door. Stepping outside was a necessary evil, a calculated risk taken to ensure the longhouse could continue to function, a brief, brutal encounter with the winter that the community was working so hard to outlast. And as you shiver, even after being back inside for a while, the image of that vast, frozen landscape stays with you, a chilling counterpoint to the odd comfort of your winter home. You push the heavy door closed behind you, shutting out the blinding white glare or the impenetrable blackness, and the biting, needle-sharp wind. The familiar rush of warm, smoky air wraps around you, a physical embrace after the brutal encounter with the outside world. You lean against the thick, earthy wall for a moment, catching your breath, the cold still clinging to your outer layers. Your fingers and toes tingle as blood returns to them. You peel off the layers of heavy wool and animal skins, shaking off the snow and ice, and rejoin the bustling, smelly, loud, life-filled world of the longhouse interior. That brief, brutal trip outside was a potent reminder of the enemy you are huddled here to defeat, the relentless, unforgiving northern winter. And as the weeks stretch into months, the focus within the longhouse shifts from simply enduring the present to waiting, hoping, and preparing for the future, for the glorious, life-giving return of spring. The deep winter months are the hardest. The stores of food, however carefully managed, dwindle. Fuel for the fire becomes harder to find and haul through the deepening snow. The monotony of the diet, the endless chores, the constant close proximity, the pervasive smells, the biting cold that somehow still finds its way in, the perpetual itching, it all grinds away at endurance. Cabin fever is a very real threat when you're confined with the same dozens of people and animals, day after day, night after night, with limited change in scenery or routine. Arguments might become more frequent, tempers shorter. The longhouse, your sanctuary, can also feel like a prison. You might find yourself staring at the smoke hole, longing for a glimpse of a brighter sky, or listening intently to the sounds outside, hoping for a subtle change in the wind's howl or the crunch of the snow that might signal a shift. But eventually, almost imperceptibly at first, things begin to change. The sun, which for weeks seemed to merely graze the horizon before disappearing, starts to climb a little higher in the sky each day. The precious hours of daylight, which shrank to mere slivers in the deepest winter, begin to stretch, adding a few minutes here and there. The quality of the light changes too, becoming less harsh and more golden. Outside, the snow might start to soften slightly on warmer days, or the ice on the water sources might become less impossibly thick. These are tiny, subtle signs, easily missed if you're not looking for them, but to the people living through the longhouse winter, they are watched for with desperate hope and profound significance. Each extra minute of daylight is a victory. Each slight softening of the ice is a promise. The mood within the longhouse begins to shift. The conversations might turn more frequently to the coming season, planning for planting crops, repairing boats for fishing or raiding, preparing tools for farming and building. The crafts focus shifts slightly too, finishing necessary clothing and textiles, perhaps starting work on items needed for spring activities. There's a renewed sense of purpose, a collective anticipation that helps to push back against the winter weariness. The sagas told in the evenings might focus less on ancient battles and more on voyages of discovery or tales of successful harvests. The games might be played with a little more energy, fueled by the growing hope. It's like the longhouse community is holding its collective breath, waiting for permission from the world outside to exhale and return to a different mode of life. Historians still argue whether the psychological impact of the long winter was a significant factor in Viking culture, perhaps contributing to their restless energy, or their desire for raiding and exploration once the weather improved. The sheer relief and burst of energy that would come with spring after months of confinement and hardship must have been immense, potentially fueling the desire to break free from the longhouse and venture out into the world. The waiting isn't passive. There's a flurry of preparation, a final push to ensure everything is ready. Tools that might have been neglected during the deepest cold are sharpened and repaired. Seeds saved from the previous harvest are checked. Fishing gear is inspected and mended. Weapons are readied for potential voyages or defense. Animal hides are processed. There's a sense of urgency beneath the anticipation. You have to be ready to seize the opportunity the moment spring arrives. A quirky tidbit is that the timing of key spring activities, like planting or setting off on voyages, was often determined by natural signs, the thawing of specific bodies of water, the return of certain migratory birds, or the budding of particular plants. These natural calendars were far more important than any fixed date. Imagine the excitement when the first swallow is spotted, or the ice on the fjord finally breaks up with a thunderous roar. The longhouse itself undergoes a subtle transformation as winter loosens its grip. As the days lengthen, the dim light filtering through the smoke holes becomes stronger, illuminating corners that were previously lost in shadow. The air might feel slightly less heavy, though the smells are still very much present. And eventually, the sounds of the outside world begin to change. The wind might lose its icy edge, replaced by a softer, perhaps even damp breeze. The drip, drip, drip of melting snow from the roof becomes a constant sound, a sweet melody after the long silence of freezing temperatures. The frozen ground begins to soften, turning the area outside the door into mud, a messy but welcome sign of thaw. The first truly warm day must have felt like a miracle. Stepping outside without immediately feeling the sting of the cold, feeling the sun on your face, hearing the sounds of birds returning, seeing the first tentative green shoots pushing up through the thawing earth, it would have been a powerful, emotional experience. The long, dark trial of winter confinement was over. The odd comforts of the longhouse, the smoky warmth, the crowded safety, the shared smells, the communal life, had served their purpose. They had kept you alive. But now, a different kind of life beckoned, a life lived more outdoors, more dispersed, more focused on growth and expansion. The longhouse wouldn't be abandoned entirely. It would still be home, a place for shelter and storage, but its intensity, its function as a total, all-encompassing world, would lessen. People would spend more time outside, working the fields, tending animals in pastures, fishing the open waters, traveling. The crowded benches would be less occupied during the day. The fire, while still used for cooking, might not need to be kept roaring constantly for heat. The air inside might finally get a chance to clear a little, though the accumulated smells would likely linger for a long time. It's a bittersweet transition, perhaps. Leaving the safety of the warm, if uncomfortable, cocoon for the promise and challenges of the world reborn in spring. The long winter in the Viking longhouse was a period of profound endurance, a test of both physical and mental resilience. It was a time when community was not just a social concept but a matter of literal, shared body heat and collective effort. The odd comforts, the smoky warmth, the crowded closeness, the familiar smells, the shared stories and games, were the elements that made this challenging existence bearable, even survivable. They were the anchors that held the community fast against the storms of winter. And as the first true signs of spring appear, as the drip of melting snow turns into the rush of thawing streams, as the sun climbs higher and the world outside begins to stir, there is a collective sigh of relief, a surge of energy, and a deep, quiet gratitude for the shelter that saw you through. The long watch is over. Now, let the sounds of the longhouse fade, the crackling fire, the distant bleating of sheep, the soft rustling of straw, the quiet breathing of dozens of people sleeping nearby. Feel the last of the day's warmth on your skin, the gentle weight of your blanket. The smells are familiar now, less assaulting, just the scent of earth and smoke and life. You are safe here, tucked away from the wind and the cold. The long, dark night is drawing in, just as it did for them, all those centuries ago. Let the sounds and the faint images of this different world settle around you. You are warm. You are sheltered. There is nothing to do now but rest. Let your own breathing slow, matching the quiet rhythm of the longhouse. Feel the comfort of knowing you are safe, just as they felt safe within these walls, waiting for the dawn. The waiting is over now. For you, it's time for sleep. Drift now peacefully into the quiet dark,